All right, welcome back, everybody, to part two of our lecture on myths and fossils. When last we left off in part one, we had just looked at the critical concept of evidence, that is, in defining what it is that we do when we do history. We look at evidence, we interpret evidence, we search for evidence to support our sense of the past and the stories we tell. And as I was saying, evidence comes in many varieties. We're going to consider some of them now. But what they all have in common, or should have in common, gets back to the very root of the word, that Latin evidentia, obvious to the mind, or obvious to the eye or mind. Evidence is meant to be something you can examine, something that can be shared. It's not secret knowledge, it's not privileged knowledge, and it's what makes history ultimately, I think, a fully accessible discipline. That is, there are really no barriers to entry in terms of who can or can't do history, and that's because the very crux of history, evidence, remains open to anyone who may wish to take a look at it. Contrasting that, of course, with the other mode of storytelling that we defined in part one, that of mythology, which really, in a basic way, often conceals any sense of evidence. It's a story told, a story reported, let's say, but not always a story that opens itself up voluntarily, anyway, to closer examination. Historians do try to examine mythology in those ways, but by their very nature, if they're making claims of supernatural authority, then that sort of authority, generally speaking, is not actually accessible in any conventional sense, the way that, say, historical evidence is. Now, the types of evidence used by historians offer clues as to that big question that we're asking in this lecture, which is, where do we come from? And one of those types of evidence is linguistics. So unlike, a broken piece of pottery buried in the sand, or some, ancient monument, carved into a wall, linguistics isn't a material artifact so much as it is a piece of language evidence that historians can use and linguists can use to trace back people's origins. Here's an article from a number of years ago that talked about a breakthrough in both genetics and linguistics, particularly in the language known as the Click language, still spoken among the people of South Africa, that is, the native San people of South Africa and certain tribal peoples of Central and West Africa. As the article concluded, it may well be the original spoken language of all humans. Maybe you've heard Click or seen it represented before, where instead of vowel sounds, the speaker uses a click of the tongue to represent what would ordinarily be, in our language, say, a vowel sound or inflection. According to this particular report, the ancient migration patterns that the scientists followed indicate that the very first true humans must have emerged on the evolutionary scene nearly 200,000 years ago, somewhere in southern Africa. So, among other things, following language patterns across Africa and in an attempt to kind of reverse engineer those language patterns, linguistically speaking, to see where the roots of these languages could be found. And as I say, among the San speakers, the so-called Click speakers of South Africa, it seems perhaps the oldest still spoken language in the world today. So in this case, following languages through history becomes a kind of evidence in its own right, a kind of linguistic evidence. Fossils, naturally, when we're talking about a distant past, fossils are another critical type of evidence that archaeologists and anthropologists and others can use to understand the human past, whether it be the human past or, even more broadly speaking, the entirety of the animal kingdom, including those that are no longer living, that is, animals that have undergone an extinction process. In this case, the article shed light on early, what evolutionary biologists believe is early primate evolution. That is, humans belong to the larger family of primates, and in this case, the most complete primate fossil ever found, a 47-million-year-old skeleton, was unveiled at the Museum of Natural History in New York, where a replica was put on display. As Tim White at the University of California, Berkeley said at the time, it is the most completely preserved fossil primate that has ever been found. It preserves things that are almost never preserved: stomach contents, tissues, hair, that only happen in very unique circumstances. So a 47-million-year-old primate fossil that provides important evidence of primate evolution across the span of time, that ultimately, following that trail forward, would connect then to its long-term descendants, including human beings. Footprints. In this case, in effect, fossilized footprints, nicknamed the footprints of Eve, discovered on the shore of a lagoon in South Africa, the Longabon Lagoon in South Africa, now back in the 90s, in 1995, footprints that were preserved in the sediment, like a plaster cast, like something you would see on Hollywood Boulevard, where the celebrities impress their hands and into the cement. In this case, these footprints are estimated to be 117,000 years old, providing direct evidence, as the slide here says, of modern human morphology. Morphology being the study of form, of, in this case, human form and shape. To peer upon these, I think, is to realize something very profound. Not just the upright bipedal posture of our human ancestors, but something else, almost intimate, really. A place where a foot had touched down 117,000 years ago, as its owner, probably entirely unaware of the historical significance of putting one foot in front of the other and leaving us, as a result, a rich bed of evidence from which we can chart our origins. When the evidence is of that type of physical form, say, as opposed to the linguistic evidence of the click speakers, scholars call them artifacts, that is, physical objects from the past. And the ongoing discoveries of early human artifacts contribute to an ever-changing picture of our history. In this case, of early stone tools found along a shoreline on the Mediterranean island of Crete, where archaeologists have discovered that tool making among our early human ancestors stretches back perhaps as far as 130,000 years. And it raises some very interesting questions. If humans were on the island of Crete, how did they get there? It's too far to swim. They must have constructed boats, thus becoming some of the earliest seafarers, earliest human seafarers. But the tools that they left behind, the stone tools that they used to work and rework other bits and pieces of stone and other materials to create, in effect, the toolkit of their lives, suggests again a very direct lineage, from their time, the humans as tool makers, to our own time, where we are, living in a world defined, of course, by the tools we use, including the very computer I'm using today to communicate this lecture to you guys. This sort of artifactual evidence, as we might call it, has yielded extraordinary finds even in our own lifetime. I mean, much of what we're talking about here has happened within the last decade or 2 decades, which reminds us that this story of early origins, that is, the history story of early origins, is a living, breathing investigation. And what we have to say about it here today very likely will be updated in the years to come. So if you come back and take the class even 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you're likely to have an even more impressive body of evidence to help explain the big questions. In this case, the Blombos Cave in South Africa, right along the Indian Ocean coast of the South African coastal region, was found an extraordinary treasure trove, really, of ancient human pieces. And what I mean in this case, 8,000 pieces of ochre. And ochre is a kind of a soft mineral element that can be used particularly in its application to color. Its reddish tint made it useful for ancient artists, for example, and others to signify patterns and images with a kind of vibrant color. In this case, you can see that someone carved into the ochre these little crosshatched lines, sort of framed with a string of seashells, dating back anywhere from 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. The scholars who worked in the Blombos Cave thinks that it perhaps represented some of the very earliest, not only art, but also jewelry. That is, the elements of what could be manufactured into wearable jewelry. And what this tells us is that, our ancestors during that period were developing cognitive abilities. That is, in their big box Homo sapien brains, developing cognitive pathways and abilities that were capable now of construing abstract and even symbolic language. When you look at those crosshatched lines, you realize perhaps they represented, in effect, kind of symbol expressions that were used to communicate value or meaning. The jewelry pieces themselves to designate status, or prestige. So we have this extraordinary evidence, historical evidence that can be examined, that can be shared, can even be dated, within a kind of window or time frame of the past, to give us the very building blocks of our species' history. Also at the Blombos Cave, and this is a cool image taken from inside the cave looking out at the Indian Ocean, are the charcoal remains that suggest fire was used in food preparation by 77,000 years ago. In other words, our human ancestors were not just consuming, nuts and berries, edible plants and such, or even for that matter, simply hunting, but taking the food that they collected, they gathered, they hunted, and preparing it over fire. The beginning of cuisine, you might say, 77,000 years ago in a South African cave. So in this case, the evidence, chemical resin. And because man is a storytelling animal, even then mythology qualifies as evidence. When we study the stories that we've told over the centuries and over the millennia, whether it be the great works of mythology like Homer's Iliad or the dime novel Wild West tales of cowboys and adventure in the American West, these kinds of mythic tales also reveal then something about not only those who created them, but the audiences for whom they were intended. And if we think of something like the Wild West stories, this was happening at a time when the United States was expanding its western boundary across the North American continent. And most of the population of the United States lived in the crowded, industrializing eastern cities. And so the target audience, for these Wild West tales really were those most urban, most sort of city folk of the time, many of whom, if not most of whom, probably would never get the opportunity to see the greater West or to travel or live in the greater West in a place like, say, California, but who thrilled, to the readings. It was great escapist literature for a sort of pent-up urban Eastern audience, you might say, to read of these, these mythic tales of frontier daring. And I say they're mythic because by and large they had only the barest connection to the actual goings on in the West. Most cowboys worked, on cattle ranches and they punched a time clock. They weren't adventurers. They weren't, swashbuckling buckaroo heroes. Those were the mythic tales told to delight the fantasies of Easterners. So what does that tell us? It tells us something about people living in 19th century America. And in that sense, the Wild West mythology is in itself a kind of evidence of the people who consumed it. So from 3,000-year-old myths to much more recent myths, the stories humans tell about the big picture are basic projections of our hopes, our fears, our fantasies, and our needs. And often, when we're talking about these long ago connections, evidence that provides links through mythology to archaeology itself, that is another way we can use archaeology, is to try to trace the source of it, or to use mythology, is to try to trace the source of it, often through archaeological digs and discoveries. In this case, the mythic birthplace of Zeus. You recall from our Italian Renaissance portrait back at the very beginning of this lecture, showing Zeus, the great patriarch of the Greek deities of mythology, Zeus holding the infant Hercules at the breast of Hera. Well, there was an actual cult of Zeus in ancient Greece, and it was thought that it was the essential job of this cult to preserve stories and to promulgate stories that would become part of the Greek mythology. Now, these were real people, not priests exactly, but in effect those who could presume to translate between the divine and the secular, that is, between the world of humans and the figurative world of the gods. And they actually built their own temples and kept their own rites and traditions. And it's there in Greece, that in central Greece, that the religious artifacts related to the worship of Zeus, found by archaeologists, suggest the existence of this early Zeus cult. And so, look, I mean, just as those Wild West stories had their writers and publishers, in the eastern part of the United States, so did the Zeus mythology have its storytellers and preservers here in Arcadia in central Greece, where it's thought that the essential, I guess we'd call it core of the mythologies, particularly the Zeus mythologies, were collected, preserved, and shared. And as I say, if you were to come back to this course, maybe even a year from now, let alone 10 or 20 years from now, what we would see is new evidence being constantly gathered. For 50 years, these ruins were submerged in the waters of a man-made reservoir in Spain. Now, due to drought, the dolmen of Guadalperal reappear. And dolmen, by the way, are those pieces of rock, those megaliths that are stood up on end, usually tall and rather rectangular in shape. The dolmen of Guadalperal reappear, as the remains of a 7,000-year-old megalithic monument consisting of around 100 standing stones, some of which you see here. Arranged they were around an oval or open space, their positioning, their distance, all of it calculated for various reasons by the original caretakers. Sometimes it was astronomical to position the megaliths or the dolma in line with certain heavenly bodies, let's say. Likely erected on the banks of what was then the Tagus River, now, as I say, a dammed up river that became a reservoir, and only through years of drought have the dolma now reappeared for the first time in half a century, giving scholars a renewed shot at studying them as evidence of a 7,000-year-old human settlement. Now, the dolma are found not just in Spain here, but in different cultures all over the world, from Ireland to India to the Korean Peninsula, and I'd say most famously Stonehenge in southern England. And they seem to have had rather common, purpose. That is ceremonial, observational, ritualistic, perhaps what we would call religious, or otherwise, expansive and rather artistic purpose to them. Sometimes they were carved, sometimes they were inscribed. They were often huge and heavy and required lots of labor to pull from the ground and to drag across open space, to the point of destination. And so for a long time, we've seen all of this as rather mysterious. But let me tell you, mysterious is a word used to substitute for we haven't figured it out yet. Look, I know mystery is sexy, and it's easy to sell a story when you call it a mystery. Who doesn't like a mystery, right? But really, historians don't think in terms of mystery. We think in terms of questions not yet answered. And it's important that we ask questions that aren't easily answered, because it allows us to take our methodology, to go looking for our evidence, to compile facts from that evidence, to fashion interpretation around those facts, and ultimately to tell a story, an empirical story that connects us to our own past. So yeah, historians are uncomfortable with mystery. We think it's a kind of cheap substitute, really, for doing your homework and figuring things out. Now, I realize that's not going to put a dent in the mystery industry. It's just my way of telling you all that this semester, as we attempt to understand history and its connection to our human past, that we're not going to lean too heavy on anything being a mystery. If we can't explain it, we're going to say we can't explain it. All right, so modern world historians strive to honor Herodotus in that sense, in depicting the past in natural rather than supernatural terms. And your textbook, Strayer, has a few categories he wants us to use. One, comparison. Let's take the Dolma of southern Spain. We know what it looks like in Stonehenge in England. What if we compare the two? What are the similarities? What, if any, conclusions can we draw from the studying of both of them that we might not gain if we looked only at one? What are the obvious differences, and what might those differences tell us about the various purposes to which they were put, and thus our own history as an evolving species. Two, let's look for connections. We got the whole world this semester, so let's look around. Let's do comparison. Let's find connection. I was trained as an American historian. My dissertation focused on the Civil War era of American history in the 19th century. But as a professor, I began teaching world history early on. And the thing that blew me away was that world history gives us such an open field to find comparisons and to draw connections. And one of the most exciting things really about world history is that when you find these connections, something you may not have considered before, something you didn't know or hadn't seen and assumed was, it was just local or a one-off. When you find those broader comparisons, you follow the chain, the way people speak, the languages they speak, the stones they put on end, the tools they make, right? Or the way they prepare their food. And you start finding connections between and across spaces, between peoples, and across landscapes. What we begin to realize is that nobody in world history is really isolated after all. And that's what we find, the third of the three C's here, is that we find our species, our history, in constant evolution. Change. Nothing is static. Nothing stands still seemingly in history. Time is a clock that continues to click, and the stories of human beings through the vast stretches of human time have continued to evolve and change and adapt and innovate. I live today down in the South Bay area of Northern California, what we usually call Silicon Valley. 2 blocks from my house is the world headquarters of Apple Computer. In some basic way, Silicon Valley is a metaphor for this third C, this change. But it's also involved with connections and even comparisons. That is, to technologies of the past, technologies of the present, connections across space. The headquarters of Apple is here in Cupertino, but it ain't where they make the phones, and so we would have to twirl the globe to Asia to find the production facilities for Apple. We'd twirl the globe again to find the many retail stores that Apple uses to sell its products. And we would just have to keep the world spinning to find the individual smartphones used by people globally. That is, Apple iPhones in virtually every corner of the habitable globe. And so, in our own time, comparison, connection, changes, they're all there. And I'm going to throw in one more, because why not? But we'll keep it in the C category, and that's context. Time and again, I'm going to remind you guys this semester that to do history right, we need to identify context. If you were to come up to me and hand me a document, hand me a picture, hand me some stone artifact, the first thing in my historian's brain that I'm going to think in response to what you've handed me, the first thing I'm going to think is, where did this come from? How old is it? Who created it? And for what reason? So who, what, where, and when. Those are the 4 C's of the 4th C, context. Who, what, where, when. It should be the very first question that comes to your mind all semester long. And it's the one that I always have to bug students about, because when you end up getting around to, say, writing something about the history we study, the first thing you're going to run roughshod over is context. You want to get to some other general aspect of something, and I'm going to be a good history professor, and I'm going to bug you. I'm going to say, well, wait a minute, when did this happen? Where did this happen, or who? Don't tell me people. Don't tell me them. Don't tell me back in the day. Tell me Persians, Central Asia, 5th century. That's what gives us our bearings. That's what allows us to triangulate an otherwise very messy, very chaotic past. So, yes, please, context, context, context. You'll see in your textbook how Strayer does this constantly. Draws comparisons, finds connections, note changes, and defines context. Get in the habit of doing these things, and you're going to have a great and successful semester, I promise you. A key framework for studying history, yeah, you guessed it, another C. I can't help myself. It's actually one of those 4 C's related to context. I said who, what, where, and when. This is chronology. Chronology, look, I'm not going to drill you guys on dates. No, you're not going to memorize lists of dates. But let's face it, if you're talking about the past, you got to tell me when something happened. And in a big subject like world history, that might mean a millennia, it might mean a century, it might mean several decades. Only rarely is it going to be an actual single year, let alone a actual single day and time. In fact, let's have some fun this semester. Let's see who can be the first one to notice when a specific day from the ancient past is mentioned. To have a day, of course, you have to have certain kinds of calendars. So for the most part, we deal in bigger and broader strokes of time. But however we measure it, time is so completely relevant to what we're doing. And Strayer identifies 3 broad categories of time, or 3 broad chronologies. What we call the Paleolithic Age, which is the longest of them. It stretches back before the human past, 2.5 million years ago. Remember, we're saying Homo sapiens about 250,000 years. So by a factor of about 100, 2.5 million years ago to 12,000 years ago, what we sometimes call the Stone Age or Paleolithic Age. Next up, the Agricultural Age, 12,000 years ago to 1700 CE. Now that means CE, Common Era. Strayer talks about the system of chronology we're doing. You might be more familiar with BC and AD, which was a form developed within the Western Christian tradition to mean before Christ, and Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. But we're doing, look, world history. We can't take a single religious nomenclature and apply it to an entire world of many peoples who have no connection or membership in that religion. So world historians created a kind of non-denominational, if you will, non-sectarian way of describing BC and AD. That is, BC is now BCE, before the Common Era, and CE is, instead of AD, is Common Era. Some folks roll their eyes. They say, come on, what is this, some kind of political correctness? But I think it's important, because when we do world history, we're not doing it through the lens of mythology. We're not doing it through the lens of a single religion. We're not here to flatter somebody's personal spiritual beliefs. We're here to understand the big picture. And so we take a big picture chronology and we call it before the Common Era, BCE, anything before 2000, now 20 years ago, and CE, Common Era, everything in the last 2020 years. So the dividing line is still the same, but the way we label it is different. So yeah, the agricultural age, from 12,000 years ago to about the 1700s CE, that is about 300 years ago. This is the great age of what we call the agricultural revolution, in which mankind completely transforms his own experience and transforms the environment along the way to create a radical break from our hunter-gathering past. We'll have a lot more to say about agriculture as we go. For now, we're saying it's one of the 3 main chronologies. The last, the one we're a part of, the Industrial Revolution age, from 1700s to the present. Our world, again, radically defined by the Industrial Revolution. The digital revolution being a part of the Industrial Revolution, that is, electronic engineering being a part of what industrialization brought to the world in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's hard to overstate just how radically our lives are defined in the industrial age by the Industrial Revolution. If all you do is wake up every morning with the sound of a soft alarm, and I hope it's a soft alarm, because who really wants to be alarmed in the morning? So the chimes that help awaken you to get ready for work or to do your homework for Paget's history class, that in of itself is part of the industrial rhythm of daily life. Factories were places that operated according to strict time standards, the beginning and ending of shifts, the beginning and ending of work days and the like, the punching of a time card. Just that alone, I mean, it's just one small example of how radically our lives have been conditioned by the industrial age. So, three broad categories. Now, this class will study the first two, the Paleolithic and agricultural. And by the time we're ending, around 500 years ago, around 1500, the Industrial Revolution will still be really, yet to come. History 308, the second half of world history, is the course that dives deep into the industrial age. So we'll take care of two of the three here, and I hope that in doing so, not only do you appreciate the importance of chronology, but that in the end you have a clearer, much better informed understanding of how our human past has created the world we live in today. So yeah, world history, a common history of humankind. But why world? We think of history along national lines. Maybe U.S. history, maybe English history. Why world history? Why blow the borders off our topic and take the entire world? Well, let's let our author Robert Strayer address that. Strayer writes in Ways of the world wars of the 20th century, revealing as they did the horrendous consequences of unchecked nationalism, persuaded some historians that a broader view of the past might contribute to a sense of global citizenship. Well, so is there an agenda here? You bet. And the agenda is to get beyond our narrow, parochial ways of viewing things and to see the broader picture, to see the connections, the comparisons, the change, and the context. To see us as part of a global species living on a single planet, part of one big story. That's what world history is trying to do. A global present seemed to call for a global past. And I think you'll enjoy the ways that we show just how global a species we've always been. We sometimes think of globalism as being a recent phenomenon. It isn't. Globalism has marked our species for most of its existence, and that will be part of the business of our course to follow that. So I'm going to leave you with this, since we've been talking about evidence and what makes history different than other ways of telling stories, say mythology. Well, we said it was evidence, right? The ability to examine evidence. So I'm going to leave you with this, and I'm going to see what you've learned today. Now, don't worry, you don't have to turn it in right away. Maybe I'll ask you about it later down the road. I just want you to have a little fun with it. What is this? Do the historian's game. Who, what, when, where? What can you discern? What might you figure out? And once you sort of contextualize it, maybe, roughly speaking, what evidence does it offer us? What facts can you draw from it? And based on that, do you think you could tell a short story about it? A short story about the human past? Well, give it a try. See what you come up with. I'll see you on Canvas.